Top 10 Fascinating Facts About Al Capone's Final Years. You will never guess what the number one fact is. Like and subscribe for weekly videos. In the comments below, list one topic you think should be in a top 10 video and comment if you subscribe to this channel. Al Capone will forever go down in history as one of the most notorious gangsters of all time. Despite countless depictions from the big screen to television, little light has been shed on the final years of his life. The following 10 entries not only describe a powerless, defeated man but also take an intimate look into his time spent on the infamous rock, Alcatraz. 10. The end of luxury. Countless myths have swirled around Capone's final years. One of them is that he stocked his entire swimming pool with fish so that he could spend his days catching them to pass time. Though the legend is false, few know that if he had wanted to do so, he would have been unable to because he was broke. The man who had once earned $40 million a year now struggled to support his family on an income of $600 a week, which was provided by former associates of the Chicago outfit. The days of living a life of luxury were gone, yet he found enjoyment walking the grounds of his property searching for butterflies with his granddaughters. His fall from the top was evident even in death, with few of his friends attending his modest funeral in winter 1947. His wife, May, remained in their Palm Island home for only 5 more years after he died. Then she was forced to sell due to financial constraints. Prior to her passing in 1986, May set ablaze every letter that Al had written her while in prison, forever erasing another side to a man we have come to know as Scarface. 9. The Convict Orchestra. During Capone's imprisonment at Alcatraz, prisoners were granted permission to purchase musical instruments if they desired to join the Convict Orchestra. Capone, who didn't have a musical bone in his body, purchased several instruments. One of them was a banjo that he played alone in a corner despite being a member of the band. He did this because the other felons despised the gangster whom they felt was constantly seeking to take control of the orchestra. This led to constant disputes, reminiscent of juvenile high school arguments, between Capone and his fellow inmates. Tensions rose to the point that the men refused to play if Capone attempted to be part of the band. The animosity boiled over one Saturday afternoon when convicted kidnapper Harmon Whaley attacked Capone from behind. The Chicago gangster was notoriously pushing Whaley around, leading Whaley to create an altercation that resulted in the orchestra ganging up on Capone. Chairs were thrown, and fists were flying. However, security guards immediately came to the rescue and saved Capone from a potential mob lynching. Hilarious as it may seem, Capone was the one who was punished for his second fight on the rock. 8. Mental disturbances. Capone was a notorious womanizer even after his marriage to his wife, May, in 1918. Years of impetuous philandering led to his contraction of syphilis. Capone purposely did not seek treatment for this STD because he feared that May would discover his adultery. His imprudent reasoning ultimately led to Capone transmitting the disease to his wife. As the years passed, Capone's untreated illness caused his mental state to significantly unravel. Prison physicians at Alcatraz took notice of his deterioration as well as his increasingly inexplicable violent outbursts, which they described as intermittent mental disturbances. Following his release on November 16, 1939, Capone was mentally incapable of returning to the outfit. Thus, he never publicly set foot in Chicago again. According to his psychiatrist in 1946, Capone had the mentality of a 12-year-old child. He spent the remainder of his days having imaginary conversations with enemies and deceased colleagues while spending most of his time wearing pajamas by the pool of his Palm Island estate. 7. Lawsuits and injections. In July 1938, the Chicago Tribune distributed a report recording Capone's decrease. A city that knew distinctly of a man who was amazing and savage was currently given an unanticipated look at a messed-up tolerant whose brain had stopped to work. Regardless of reports of the hoodlum frequently being an aggravation while detained, the paper focused on Capone, who was presently in a constant shock, was not rough and not, at this point required a straitjacket. Such a harmless portrayal was insufficient to influence the city of Miami Beach, which proudly censured Capone's appearance in Florida. Dreading the savagery and defilement that was the embodiment of Capone's past, city authorities sued the hoodlum. They expressed that his new home was a threat to the security and prosperity of residents. Such a claim was unimportant, in any case, for a man whose psyche could at this point don't work adequately. Regardless of the way that the best clinical consideration was stood to him, a portion of the recommended types of treatment were faulty. A valid example: to battle the syphilis by raising his internal heat level, specialists gave Capone infusions to incite intestinal sickness, a conscious immunization that demonstrated purposeless. 6. Cocaine withdrawal. Aside from the untreated venereal disease that was gradually destroying Capone's brain, he He was also suffering from extreme cocaine withdrawal by the time he arrived at Alcatraz. In fact, his dependency and abuse of the booger sugar was so severe that the narcotic had eaten away at his nasal septum, creating a significant perforation. However, many historians, as well as the prison's physician, Dr. Raymond M. Ritchie, erroneously attributed this observation to syphilis. Interestingly enough, the collapse of Capone's nasal septum was not fully explained until nearly 60 years later when Dr. Jack Shapiro, a medical consultant, examined Capone's X-ray plates from June 4, 1938. The findings showed no evidence of disease in Capone's sinuses, further shedding light on the severity of the gangster's addiction. If the debilitating symptoms of syphilis weren't enough to break a man who once ran an entire city, now he was faced with the agonizing effects of withdrawal. Though no sympathy should be afforded to a man as ruthless as he was, it's reasonable to assume that he truly suffered following his conviction and imprisonment. 5. Capone's entourage at the hospital. After his delivery from Alcatraz, a debilitated Capone looked for treatment at the famous Johns Hopkins Hospital. Obscure to the criminal, the emergency clinic's leading group of trustees was worried about his reputation and would not concede him. This happened again in Guilford, which eventually drove Capone to take up habitation at Union Memorial Hospital in Baltimore. Upon his appearance, Capone assumed control over the medical clinic's whole 5th floor. He likewise brought along a whole company comprising of guardians, a masseur, his hairdresser, various relatives, and a taste analyzer to guarantee that his food wasn't harmed. For the following 5 weeks, Capone was under the consideration of Dr. Joseph E. Moore. Following his release, Capone was colossally thankful for the sympathetic consideration he'd got at the sole emergency clinic that permitted his induction. To show his appreciation, he gave 2 Japanese sobbing cherry trees, one of which actually stands today outside the clinic's passage almost 80 years after the fact. 4. Penicillin. By the early 1940s, a grossly overweight Capone lacked mental and physical coordination and suffered epilepsy-like seizures. Often walking rapidly in a jerky motion, he whistled and hummed while speaking to imaginary beings. It wasn't until 1942 that penicillin became available. However, with the War Production Board imposing a strict quota on the antibiotic, it was exceptionally difficult to obtain. Fortunately for Capone, Dr. Joseph E. Moore managed to acquire the drug, which he administered to his notorious patient. Interestingly enough, Capone became one of the first syphilis patients in the history of medicine to be treated with the antibiotic. Nevertheless, Capone's mental state had irreversibly deteriorated by that time. No drug could reverse the mobster's dire and mortal condition. However, the penicillin did halt the advancement of his debilitating symptoms for some time. 3. Torture and special privileges. Unlike present-day America, where a majority of prisons look more like country clubs than actual penitentiaries, Alcatraz was the epitome of what it meant to serve hard time. It has been said that inmates were subjected to harsh discipline at the hands of guards and Warden James Johnston. This included beatings, starvation, and being thrown in the dungeon. Perhaps most of the inmates' dismay about their treatment was their claim that Capone was the only prisoner who did not receive such brutal handling. Instead, he was granted special privileges due to his political influence. In one instance, convict John M. Stedig claimed that he and another prisoner had circulated a petition asking for reading material and 1 motion picture to be shown per month, a request that was met with the duo being chained and starved in the dungeon. This form of punishment even led Capone to take sides with Stedig, going on strike with the other prisoners in protest of his fellow inmates' abuse. Regardless of Capone's support, the preferential handling afforded to the mobster enraged fellow prisoners. They described the Rock as a hellhole from which men are willing to risk their lives to escape. Despite Stedig's claims, prison officials emphatically denied the story, which originally ran in the Madera Tribune in December 1934. However, the government maintained that Alcatraz was not designed as a place for reformation. 2 final arrangements. Until Capone died on January 25, 1947, the press staked out his Florida home with the hopes of catching a glimpse, and picture, of the infamous mobster. To avoid a public spectacle, Capone's body was secretly transported non-stop from the family estate in a regular car on Highway 41 to Chicago. That evening, Capone's son, Sonny, announced to the press that his father had passed. A hearse arrived, only to leave the residence with an empty casket inside. Unknown to those in attendance, with the exception of Capone's family, a fake funeral was held the following day. Some of the biggest names in Florida, including Desi Arnaz, paid their respects. A short time later, the Capone family made their way to Chicago by train with reporters in tow. Meanwhile, members of the outfit were spreading the word as to when and where Capone's real funeral would be held. Following a mass at Holy Name Cathedral in Chicago, Capone was buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery on February 1, 3 days prior to the scheduled date given to the media. However, this would not be Capone's final resting place. Following his mother's death in 1952, his casket was moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery, where it remains today. 1 Capone vs. Lucas. James Tex Lucas was a lifelong criminal in each sense, making mayhem for an incredible duration while bringing wretchedness those he ran over. In 1935, his horrendous deeds at last drove him to Alcatraz, where he proceeded with his rebellious shenanigans. He continually occupied with stealthy direct, including a vicious getaway endeavor which prompted the demise of Officer Royal C. Klein in 1938. Despite his huge rap sheet, Lucas will always be known as the one who almost ended the life of Al Capone. On June 23, 1936, Capone wound up in the Give Room. Lucas, who had figured out how to acquire half of some scissors. Lucas utilized the scissors to fiercely slice the Chicago hoodlum a few times. Capone supported chest wounds and shallow safeguard slices to his hands, however he endured. Lucas' clarification for the endeavored murder was that Capone had taken steps to slaughter him, an amazingly conceivable case given Capone's destructive history. Although Lucas had been given a lifelong incarceration for homicide, the U.S. legal framework paroled the executioner in 1958. Lucas lived as a liberated person for an additional 40 years until he passed on November 28, 1998.